Unlocking the queenside for early diagonal pressure, this maneuver preps the bishop for an active role. Asserting central space immediately is a common and sensible response to white's flank opening, preparing for rapid piece development. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal influence, the fianchetto aims to contest central squares and prepare for a queenside pawn push. Developing the knight to c6 immediately contests the center and prepares for d5, offering a solid pawn structure. Developing knights to active squares early is key to controlling the center and preparing for castling. Disrupting white's comfortable development, this pawn thrust aggressively contests central space and limits the bishop's scope. Steering the knight centrally, white initiates a battle for central squares and aims to exploit the slightly exposed black pawn. Developing the knight actively shores up the central pawn's advance and prepares for further piece deployment. A tentative pawn advance, potentially allowing black's knight to skewer the king and queen, while opening a diagonal for the bishop, is a risky proposition. Expanding the center with d5 solidifies black's pawn chain, creating immediate tension and asserting influence over key squares. Pressing the knight on c6, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses after the inevitable exchange, while simultaneously developing another piece towards the center. Developing the bishop to d7 shores up the central pawn structure and prepares for castling kingside, a sound positional maneuver to consolidate after white's active piece play. Securing the monarch behind a pawn wall now allows white to consolidate his central pawn, prepare for kingside expansion, and potentially activate his rook on the f-file, while black's immediate central occupation may become a target for later undermining. Developing the bishop to d6 enhances piece coordination, challenging the queen's potential influence on the c-file and preparing for a potential e7 maneuver to solidify the center, while also adding another defender to the kingside. Opening the f-file introduces immediate kingside tension, challenging black's pawn advances and potentially creating attacking opportunities against the black king. Unlocking the kingside center with that pawn sacrifice dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating central tension that demands immediate attention and may lead to dynamic imbalances. Reclaiming the knight opens lines for your queen and rook, while simultaneously challenging black's pawn chain and potentially creating weaknesses around their monarch if they defend too passively. Securing the monarch behind a fresh pawn wall, black prioritizes king safety and sets the stage for potential queenside expansion or a more passive defensive posture, choosing immediate shelter over further central engagement. Re-establishing the knight's central influence after the exchange on f3 solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares for potential advances on the kingside, while also providing a timely defensive resource should black's advanced e-pawn become a target. Activating the rook on the e-file promises a dynamic clash, potentially opening lines towards white's king once that advanced e-pawn is dealt with. Striking at the enemy's pawn structure, this exchange immediately forces black into a doubled pawn scenario, fundamentally altering the pawn landscape and creating long-term weaknesses that white can exploit. Opening the b-file presents a double-edged sword. While it offers potential for queen activity, it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure on black's queenside and creates permanent weaknesses around the king. Retreating the knight to e2 offers a tactical reprieve, preparing to redeploy it to potentially control the vital central squares or reinforce the kingside, while also opening the f-file for potential future rook activity, aiming to compensate for the positional concession of the doubled c-pawns. Immediately introducing a knight to the advanced e4 square creates significant dynamic tension, challenging white's central pawn structure and opening up a potential avenue for further piece activation. Connecting the rooks via queen repositioning opens up interesting possibilities on the kingside and prepares for a potential d4 push. Reactivating the rook to the e-file, black aims to contest the open file that white's queen now guards, subtly preparing for potential pawn breaks or offering a defensive post should white's knight advance further. Solidifying central control and preparing to activate the queen is the immediate goal, Yet this pawn push might be sacrificing a crucial tempo for black's knight to achieve greater influence. Boldly venturing the knight into the heart of white's camp, this maneuver immediately challenges the pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's developing harmony, potentially creating tactical fireworks. Redirecting your queen to the other flank aims to exploit the exposed kingside, potentially setting up a battery on the h4-d8 diagonal, or reinforcing the center if black decides to push the e-pawn further. Disrupting white's knight's central presence, this exchange forces a pawn recapture and alters the immediate pawn structure, potentially creating an open file for white's rook if it's brought to bear. Reclaiming the queen efficiently after the knight's sacrifice creates an immediate central presence and prepares for kingside castling, while the doubled pawns on the c-file for black remain a significant long-term weakness to exploit. The queen now joins the fray, seeking to create complications on the queen's side and potentially target white's uncastled king by utilizing the open e-file that has developed. Embracing the central space now offers a dynamic pathway, potentially opening lines for your rook and queen while challenging black's knight's outpost. Exposing the king's defenses, black chooses to capture the pawn, opening up lines and potentially initiating a more dynamic phase of the game by challenging white's central pawn structure. Opening the d-file now promises significant central influence for white, aiming to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create attacking chances against the king's flank. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately introduces significant attacking possibilities, forcing white to address the direct threat to their king's safety and potentially opening lines for black's other pieces. Challenging the knight's outpost on g3 opens new avenues for attack on white's kingside, potentially creating weaknesses around the castled monarch. Black's rook, now aggressively positioned on e3, aims to disrupt white's coordination, particularly targeting the weakened e4 pawn and potentially creating havoc on the third rank. Re-establishing pressure on the f-file, the queen repositions, creating potential threats against the vulnerable g7 pawn and offering a calculated retreat if the knight on g3 needs support. Unleashing a bishop to a commanding diagonal, black aims to disrupt white's centralized knight and exert pressure on the kingside, creating fascinating tactical possibilities and potentially weakening white's pawn structure as compensation for its placement. Securing the king's escape route becomes paramount as the rook aggressively probes along the third rank. This move gently nudges the monarch away from potential discovered attacks and future mating nets. Sacrificing material on the queen's side to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for attack, this move initiates a bold gambit. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, white's queen swoops in to seize the f7 pawn, instantly creating a mating threat that black's king can barely escape. This aggressive foray shatters any semblance of defensive solidity black has managed to assemble, forcing an immediate and critical response. The queen's recapture, accepting the sacrifice, seals black's fate as this position devolves into a swift, decisive attack against an exposed monarch. White's pieces, no longer hindered by the queen's defensive presence, now converge with alarming speed. The rook's dominion over the open file is now absolute, projecting power directly towards the black king's potentially exposed perimeter. The king, now exposed on the 7th rank, finds itself a tempting target as the queens are off the board, initiating a desperate endgame where survival hinges on activating its remaining defenders. The rook suddenly finds itself isolated on the queen side, a target far from the safety of its own pawns, creating a crucial imbalance in the ensuing endgame. Re-establishing peace activity after the whirlwind exchange on the f-file is paramount for black. Bringing the bishop towards the center aims to reactivate it and potentially pressure white's somewhat exposed king. Asserting control over the open file and driving the enemy king into a defensive posture, this move initiates a powerful initiative that could soon decide the game. Finally, the black king seeks refuge, stepping away from the immediate crossfire of the rook and bishop, aiming to consolidate behind a pawn shield amidst this chaotic exchange. Securing the central file is paramount as the material simplifies, giving your rook a clear path for activity and coordination with the remaining pieces. The bishop's return to g4 intends to challenge the suddenly exposed white king, aiming to exploit the pressure on the f1 diagonal now that the rook has been exchanged. Regaining the rook is paramount, but the timing creates a significant positional concession by allowing black's bishop to solidify its presence on the king side. The bishop's retreat to d6 aims to re-establish some defensive presence on the king's side, but it feels like a passive response to white's relentless pressure on the open files. It allows white's rook on e1 to potentially coordinate with other pieces, and the bishop now occupies a square where it doesn't exert much influence over the critical center or potential attacking avenues. Consider the possibility of actively defending with a pawn push instead, or finding a way to disrupt white's centralized pieces. Reasserting central influence with the knight's advance, this maneuver eyes potential breakthroughs on the king side and aims to disrupt black's rook activity. Reclaiming the bishop to its initial square signals a retreat, acknowledging the precariousness of its advanced position and aiming to consolidate forces against white's consolidated central pawns and active rook. Securing the king's safety on the king side is paramount, preventing potential infiltrations from the aggressive black bishop. Reclaiming initiative on the open c-file emerges as the immediate priority, forcing white to confront the looming threat against their rook and solidifying black's piece activity. The bishop now finds its ideal diagonal, exerting pressure on the queenside pawns and eyeing potential weaknesses around black's king if it ever dares to step out. Aiming to crack open the queenside, this pawn thrust seeks to challenge white's pawn chain and perhaps open lines for the bishop. The monarch's repositioning to g1 aims to consolidate safety, preparing for potential diagonal threats and freeing up the h-file for future rook activity should the opportunity arise, a prudent step in this tense, materially balanced scenario. Pushing the passed pawn relentlessly, black aims to create queenside chaos and potential mating threats, a bold gamble in this increasingly open position after white's king has been somewhat exposed. Opening the queenside now with the pawn push, a bold attempt to create an active passed pawn and exploit the exposed black king, fundamentally alters the game's complexion. The rook slides to the queenside, aiming to exploit the open, a file and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to g3 aims to develop an offensive presence on the king side, potentially supporting a future h4 push or redeploying to f5 to challenge black's bishop control. The rook and knight exchange initiated by black is a desperate attempt to salvage something from this materially imbalanced position, offering a bishop for a piece that already proved problematic for white's coordination, hoping to create further complications and potentially tie down white's remaining advanced pieces. Activating the bishop to a more active diagonal clears the way for potential pawn advances and re-engages the piece in the battle for the center. A clever repositioning, aiming to untangle the bishop from its current pawn blockade and prepare to contest the open file with its rook. The rook now aggressively claims the open file, directly challenging the opponent's vulnerable pawn structure and probing for weaknesses. A desperate attempt to create counterplay by activating the rook on an open file, though it leaves the pawn structure behind the king quite exposed. Reasserting rook dominance on the open file is crucial, aiming to penetrate the opponent's weakened queenside and exploit the exposed black king. A quiet defensive maneuver, aiming to prevent the opposing knight from any sudden incursions onto the king side, and creating a safe haven for the king should the position open further. Activating the rook on the d-file is crucial now to contest the open file and potentially exploit the pawn weaknesses on black's queenside. Reasserting the bishop's presence on the d6 square, this maneuver aims to solidify the defensive structure and prepare for potential counterplay, eyeing the queenside pawn majority that white has just conceded. The rook repositioning now creates opportunities to contest the open f-file, aiming to pry open further lines towards black's somewhat exposed king. Seizing initiative on the queenside, this move directly challenges white's doubled pawns and aims to unlock black's dormant queenside majority, potentially creating a dangerous passed pawn. The knight's journey to the center, after a long traverse, now eyes potential infiltration routes or defensive redeployments to shore up weaknesses. Liberating the rook from its pin allows it to contest the open c-file, a crucial artery for attacking the white king's recently exposed weaknesses. Regaining the pawn simplifies the structure and prepares to activate the rook on the open file. Asserting control over the open file with this checking thrust challenges white's king and seeks to disrupt their defensive setup, forcing immediate reactions and potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure. Reasserting control over the central files and preparing to consolidate the queenside pawn majority is the immediate goal of this repositioning. Pressing the c-pawn forward aims to disrupt white's control of that crucial diagonal and potentially create a passed pawn itself, though its advance does open lines for white's rook. Securing the king from further checks is paramount after the recent series of exchanges. This repositioning aims to bring the monarch to a safer square while maintaining defensive integrity. A crucial decision point emerges as black aims to activate the rook along the open file, potentially generating counterplay against white's doubled pawns. Unlocking the c-file's potential, this bishop repositions, eyeing the distant queenside pawns while preparing to shore up the central structure. Challenging the rook on the second rank is a proactive step, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and force concessions, although it repositions the black rook from its potentially more active patrolling position. Recentralizing the monarch provides a safer haven amidst the tactical storm, preparing to support the pawn structure as the game simplifies into a rook and pawn endgame. The advance of the pawn to c3 signals a determined effort to create a passed pawn, potentially overwhelming black's defensive structure. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal dominance is the immediate challenge after black's surprising pawn advance, aiming to dislodge white's active piece and reopen lines for the enemy rook. Sacrificing the rook here is a desperate gamble to reignite a flicker of counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create chaos, though it feels more like a last gasp than a calculated strategy.